Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal Britt's return was not a triumph, not the kind of miraculous reappearance that brought closure and relief. It was something colder, sharper, like a ghost stepping across the threshold of memory, carrying with her both the luminous and the shattering pieces of a story that had never found its end. For those who had loved her, who had been forced to bury her in their hearts, her sudden presence was almost too much to comprehend. They had mourned her, built walls against the grief, and forced themselves to adapt to a world without her. Now, with a single fleeting glimpse, all of that careful work came undone. The wound was open again, but this time there was a deeper dread humming beneath the surface, because it wasn't just her return that mattered, it was what her return revealed. Time itself had become the most merciless enemy in this new chapter, and it was already winning. Jason saw her first. It happened in the blur of an ordinary moment, crowds spilling through the gates at the Paris airport, voices echoing off the vaulted ceilings, the constant movement of strangers who meant nothing to him. Then, there she was. At first he thought he had imagined her. His mind had played tricks before, it wasn't unusual for the face of someone he'd lost to flash before him in a crowd. But this wasn't some passing resemblance. It was Britt. Her eyes, still carrying the sharp intelligence he remembered, were dulled now by fatigue. Her movements were slow, almost hesitant, as though each step was measured against pain. Even in that brief instant, he knew it was her. And he knew, with an instinct born of years in dangerous worlds, that if he let her slip away in that crowd, he might never find her again. He followed. Not too close, he knew better than to tip her off, but just enough to track her path. The trail led out of Paris, across borders, until he reached Dubrovnik, a city of stone and shadow, where the Adriatic glittered deceptively bright beyond the winding streets. There, tucked away in a modest hotel far from the tourist bustle, Jason found her. She wasn't living in freedom. She was confined. Pascal was the man at her side, though to call him a companion was misleading. He hovered, guarded, monitored her as though she might break or vanish if he let her out of sight. The moment Jason saw the dynamic between them, his instincts told him that Pascal was both caretaker and gatekeeper. The room Britt occupied was not the sanctuary of someone who had escaped danger. It was a holding place, stripped of personality, heavy with silence. The curtains were always drawn, keeping the light and the world at bay. A row of prescription bottles stood neatly on the bedside table, their labels foreign but unmistakably medical. The bed was always perfectly made, yet the indentation of sleepless nights remained etched into the mattress. On the desk lay unopened books and a phone she never touched. Pascal moved with quiet efficiency, overseeing every detail of her day, when she ate, when she rested, when she took her medication. He was no doctor, but he carried himself like one when it came to her care, an ever-present reminder of how fragile she had become. Jason didn't need medical training to read the signs. Her hands trembled when she lifted a cup. Her legs occasionally betrayed her, a sudden hitch in her gait betraying weakness. At times, her gaze would drift away, locked on something far in the distance, or perhaps on nothing at all, until she blinked and pulled herself back. Huntington's disease had claimed more of her than he'd feared, and it was still advancing. This wasn't a woman who had beaten her fate. This was someone fighting a battle she could not win, buying days or weeks with medicine and willpower, knowing full well the tide would eventually consume her. As he pieced together the timeline, Jason understood. Her faked death in 2023 had never been about running from the law, or escaping an enemy in the shadows. It had been about protecting the people she loved. Liesl, her mother, had endured unbearable loss already. Brad, her dearest friend, had stood by her through storms that would have broken others. She had wanted to spare them the slow-motion horror of watching her body betray her. By vanishing, she had hoped to leave them with memories untouched by disease, memories of her as vibrant, witty, capable, not the diminished version she feared she was becoming. It was, in its own way, an act of love. But now, her presence shattered that carefully constructed illusion. All the questions she had tried to avoid were rising to the surface. Why had she decided for them what they could or couldn't bear? Why had she assumed their love was not strong enough to weather the truth? Those questions, Jason knew, would burn in them as much as the joy of seeing her again. Jason's own instincts made it impossible for him to stand aside. He remembered every dangerous mission they'd shared, every time she had risked herself for the sake of others. She had faced down enemies like Heather Weber without hesitation, stepping into darkness again and again when the people around her needed saving. But this enemy was different. You couldn't shoot it, outthink it, or negotiate with it. Huntington's didn't care about courage. It didn't yield to loyalty. And yet, for all the impossibility of the fight, Jason couldn't let her slip away into isolation again. When he told Carly what he had seen, she cautioned him. Pulling Britt back into her old life, Carly warned, would subject her to pity she had spent her life avoiding. It might rob her of the small measure of dignity she still had. But Jason's mind was set. Letting her vanish again, without anyone having the chance to say goodbye, would be a regret he would never outlive. The larger risk was in what came next. If word of her survival reached Port Charles, it would ripple through every connection she had left. Liesl might rush to her side in joy, only to be consumed by rage when she learned the truth about the deception. Brad might feel betrayed even as relief washed over him. And if anyone thought there was a chance, a real chance, of saving her, the quiet sorrow of acceptance would turn into a desperate, all-consuming fight. In the background, Jason had already begun to hear whispers. Rumors of a secret research program, headed by Professor Henry Dalton, that might be connected to WSB operations. The details were vague, but the talk was enough to spark a dangerous hope. If the program was real, if it was close to a breakthrough, it could change everything. But hope was a double-edged blade, and Jason knew that dangling it in front of Britt, or anyone who loved her, could do more damage than the truth itself if it proved false. For now, he watched from the shadows, weighing his options, every hour conscious of how quickly the clock was running down. Britt's time was slipping away, and if he didn't act soon, the choice of how her story ended would be taken from him forever. She would vanish again, this time not by her own design, but because her body had finally surrendered. And then, all that would be left were unanswered questions, and the aching knowledge that her last chapter had been written in silence. If you'd like, I can continue into the next act. Where Jason makes his move to reach her, Pascal's loyalties are tested, the secret leaks into Port Charles, and the possible WSB cure forces every character to confront just how far they are willing to go to keep Britt alive. That part will be even more layered and emotionally intense. If the truth of Britt's survival broke loose in Port Charles, it would spread like wildfire through every corner of the city, igniting reactions that would be impossible to contain. The mere headline, "Britt Westbourne alive," would dominate every whispered conversation in the Metro Court, every stolen glance in the General Hospital corridors, every quiet moment in the homes of those who had grieved her. People would replay the day of her supposed death, the funeral, the tears shed, the vows made to move forward. And then the narrative they had lived with for years would unravel, thread by thread, until all that remained was the staggering reality that she had been alive all along. For Liesl, the shock would hit like a tidal wave. In the first instant, she would feel the intoxicating rush of possibility, her daughter's arms around her again, the sound of her voice, the chance to reclaim years they had lost. That joy would last mere seconds before the anger arrived, sharp and suffocating. The knowledge that Britt had chosen to keep herself hidden, to let Liesl believe she was dead, would stab deeper than any physical wound. Liesl would remember every sleepless night spent staring into the dark, wondering if she could have done more, if she had failed as a mother. She would remember the bitterness of mourning while the truth, Britt breathing, living, was concealed. The duality of emotions, the pull between embracing her child and demanding an explanation, would threaten to tear her apart. Brad's experience would be no less harrowing. He had been Britt's confidant, the person she trusted with her sharpest secrets and her most vulnerable fears. Losing her had carved out a piece of him that nothing could fill. To learn now that she had lived in secret would shake the foundation of that trust. He might understand the logic, that she had wanted to spare him the pain of watching her decline, but understanding could never erase the hollow ache of being left behind. Every moment he had longed for her advice, her humor, her friendship, would now feel tainted by the reality that she had been out there, choosing silence. For those who had admired her from a greater distance, the colleagues, the occasional allies, the people who had once been charmed or impressed by her resilience, this revelation would be a harsh lesson in the complexity of love. They would have to reckon with the idea that sometimes devotion doesn't mean staying by someone's side to the bitter end. Sometimes it means removing yourself from their story entirely, believing that absence can be an act of mercy. And for many, that concept would be impossible to accept without bitterness. Meanwhile, a different kind of energy would take hold in the city. Among fans, colleagues, and even strangers who had followed her life from the periphery, a spark of hope would flare. Small, fragile, but powerful enough to spread. Rumors had already begun to circulate in whispers, stories about a clandestine research project led by the enigmatic Professor Henry Dalton. The details were murky, obscured by layers of secrecy, but the essence of the story was simple. Dalton was said to be on the brink of a revolutionary breakthrough in the treatment of Huntington's disease. And the WSB, with all its shadowy influence, was maneuvering to secure access to his work before anyone else. If the project was real, and if it was as close to fruition as the rumors claimed, it might represent the only genuine lifeline for Britt. For the first time since her diagnosis, there could be something tangible to fight for, something beyond the slow, relentless march of the disease. But the danger of hope lay in its timing. In the race between science and mortality, no one could predict which would reach the finish line first. The thought of the cure arriving too late was a knife to the heart of everyone who dared believe in it. No one understood that cruel equation more than Britt herself. Each morning was an act of both gratitude and dread. She would wake and take stock of her body, the steadiness of her legs, the clarity of her speech, the control in her hands. She lived with the acute awareness that one day she would wake and find one of those abilities gone, perhaps forever. That awareness transformed every detail of her day into something precious, the way a mug of tea warmed her fingers, the rhythm of rain tapping against the window, the scent of the ocean when she dared step outside. She no longer measured her life in the vague increments of months or years. Her timeline was composed of moments. Small, crystalline fragments that shimmered precisely because they might be the last of their kind. The brush of a familiar hand against hers. A laugh so deep it made her chest ache. The feeling of sunlight on her face, knowing she might not have the strength to seek it out tomorrow. If this was to be the end of her story, she refused to let it be written in the ink of fear. She wanted it etched in the language of courage, of choices made with love rather than desperation. She wanted those who had known her best to remember her as she had been, not diminished by the disease, but defined by the battles she chose to fight. And if Henry Dalton's research could buy her even a fragment of a future, she would embrace it, not because she feared death, but because she still had so much life she wanted to taste. In the quiet of her hotel room, as Pascal moved silently about his duties, Britt would close her eyes and imagine Port Charles. Not the city she had left, but the city as it could be if she returned. She could picture Liesl's fierce embrace, Brad's tear-streaked smile, even the conflicted looks from those who wouldn't know whether to welcome her or condemn her. She knew it would be messy, emotional, maybe even painful. But she also knew that some endings were worth walking back into the storm for. And somewhere deep inside, beneath all the layers of resignation, a spark of that old Britt, the one who could defy anything, still burned, waiting to decide whether this was truly the last chapter or merely the start of another. Jason understood that the path ahead was not just uncertain, it was littered with moral landmines, each choice carrying a cost he would have to live with for the rest of his life. One road meant keeping the truth locked away, allowing Britt to slip quietly from this world as she wished, her dignity preserved, her loved one spared the sight of her decline. The other meant tearing open the fragile peace her disappearance had left behind, forcing everyone who had once been part of her life to confront the reality of her condition, to gather for the kind of farewell that would be equal parts blessing and torment. Neither choice was clean. Both would leave scars. In the quiet moments when he allowed himself to think it through, Jason knew that no decision could spare anyone from pain, not Britt, not the people who loved her, and not himself. If he kept her secret, they would be denied the chance to say goodbye, and some wounds would never close. If he revealed the truth, the final days she had chosen to protect would be consumed by tears, questions, and the inevitable weight of watching her fade. It wasn't a question of whether there would be suffering, but of which version of it could be borne. And yet, as much as the thought of breaking her trust unsettled him, Jason couldn't ignore a simple truth that kept circling back in his mind. In these short, dwindling days, it might be the presence of those who had shaped her life, their voices, their touch, their memories shared aloud, that could give her something no treatment or cure could match. It might not slow the progression of the disease or change its outcome, but it could give her strength in a way that isolation never could. The kind of strength that came from knowing, beyond all doubt, that you were loved right to the end. He pictured it in fragments, uninvited but impossible to push away, Liesl clutching her daughter's hand, Brad coaxing a laugh from her in the middle of a hard day, a quiet moment between Britt and someone she hadn't seen in years but had never stopped caring for. These images carried a weight that was both painful and tempting. They made him wonder if denying her those moments was truly protecting her, or simply giving her a cleaner but lonelier exit. Jason knew time was not on his side. Each day he hesitated was a day lost, a day the disease took more from her. The clock was not only ticking for her body, it was ticking on his ability to make the choice at all. There would come a point where Britt might no longer have the clarity or strength to participate in that decision, and if he waited until then, the choice would be his alone to make. That thought unsettled him more than anything else. What made it worse was the shadow of the WSB and the whispered rumors of Henry Dalton's secret project. If those whispers were true, and the agency was indeed moving to seize or control the research, then any move Jason made could draw dangerous attention. Not just to Britt, but to everyone around her. Revealing her existence might not only bring her loved ones to her side, it could put her squarely in the crosshairs of people who would see her as an opportunity rather than a person. That possibility was enough to make even the clearest path blur into uncertainty. Still, he could feel the decision building inside him like a tide he couldn't hold back forever. He would have to choose soon. Between silence and revelation, between solitude and reunion. And when that moment came, Jason suspected he would lean toward giving Britt the gift she hadn't asked for but might need more than anything, the chance to spend what time she had left surrounded by the people who had mattered most. Even if it hurt her at first. Even if it hurt everyone. Because sometimes the most merciful thing wasn't shielding someone from pain, but making sure they didn't face it alone. For days in Dubrovnik, he had kept himself to the margins, moving in the shadows of narrow streets and listening to the rhythm of Britt's life. The city's old stone walls seemed to mirror the fortress she had built around herself, impenetrable to anyone who didn't know where to look. Every morning, Pascal emerged from the hotel precisely at the same hour, carrying a list of errands in one pocket and a folded handkerchief in the other. Every afternoon, he left again, always for exactly 17 minutes, to collect fresh medication from a local pharmacy. Jason had timed it over and over until he could predict Pascal's movements like clockwork. That 17-minute gap was his window. On the morning he chose to act, Dubrovnik was swathed in a gray, sea-heavy mist. Jason waited until Pascal left, his footsteps fading into the damp hush of the cobblestones, before crossing the street and entering the hotel. The desk clerk didn't look up from her dog-eared novel. Jason moved past her without a word, climbing the stairs in silence. Britt's room was exactly as he'd imagined from watching it through the fire escape, dim, airless, the curtains drawn so tightly that the air itself seemed heavy. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, wearing a soft gray sweater that hung a little too loosely on her frame. Her hair, longer now, was pulled back loosely, revealing the tired angles of her face. When her eyes met his, the moment froze, recognition, disbelief, and a flicker of something softer that she tried to hide. Jason didn't waste time with pleasantries. He crossed the room and knelt in front of her, speaking low but steady. He told her he wasn't here to force her into anything she didn't want, but that she needed to understand the truth. Her time was finite, and the people she had loved, people who still loved her, deserved to see her again before it was too late. She shook her head, her hands tightening around each other in her lap. Her voice was barely a whisper when she said she couldn't let them remember her like this. She wanted their last memories to be of the strong, defiant Britt they had known, not of a woman in decline. But Jason pressed, not with demands, but with quiet conviction. He reminded her that even if the disease had taken pieces of her, it hadn't taken all of her.